They laughed. They always laugh. That's the part that gets me about these stories, the ones where somebody's got an idea that doesn't fit into what people think they already know. And the first thing they do is laugh. They laugh until the laughing becomes a kind of cruelty, the kind that settles into a community like frost on a window, and then it becomes something harder to break than ice. And you know what the worst part is? They never think they're being cruel. They think they're being sensible. They think they're protecting themselves from foolishness. The cruelty is secondary. It's just what falls out of their mouths when they don't understand something. This is Clara. I've spent a lot of years on the frontier, not the romantic kind you read about, the real kind, where the winters don't care about your plans, and the community doesn't care much about your pride. I've got calluses on my hands from doing work that needs doing, and I've got a low tolerance for people who confuse mocking others with being intelligent. And I'm here to tell you about a woman named Aino, a Finnish widow who came to the prairie with nothing but a secret her grandmother had whispered to her before she died. That secret, the one everybody dismissed as superstition and foolishness, ended up keeping her family alive through a winter so brutal that 3 other families lost children to the cold. Children who didn't have to die, children whose mothers just didn't know what Aino knew. Aino came to the frontier in 1887 with her husband, Kurtu's son, a man named Aino, who was good with his hands, but better at dreaming than at planning. They built a cabin like everybody else, rough timber, gaps between the logs that you could practically see daylight through in certain spots, a fireplace that ate wood like it was water and gave back only half the heat it should. They had good intentions and very little money, which in the frontier means you're already behind before you've even started. The gaps in the walls were the kind of gaps that made you understand, bone deep, that this structure was never going to hold the weather out. Not really. Not unless something changed. Aino was practical. She wasn't the kind to look at a failing situation and wish it different. She was the kind to look at it and ask what could be done with what she had. She'd walk around the cabin in the early morning, before the children were awake, and she'd run her fingers over the gaps between the logs, calculating the depth, the length, the amount of space. She'd watch dust fall through certain cracks when the wind was right. She'd feel the way the cold seemed to pour in from invisible places. She was the kind of woman who asked questions and then didn't stop asking until she had answers. That's a dangerous quality in a frontier woman. It makes people nervous. It makes them wonder if you're satisfied with your lot. And if you're not satisfied, maybe that's a reflection on them, and they'd rather not have to think about that. Aino had a son by Aino, a good boy named Juko, serious even as a child, the kind of child who watches more than he speaks. He was the kind of boy who noticed when his mother got thinner, when her hands started shaking, when she held her cough, like a secret she didn't want anyone to know about. Juko was the kind of child who learned early that observation was a form of survival. She had a daughter, Kaisa, bright and quick, with her mother's sharp mind and her father's gentler way of moving through the world. Kaisa was 9 years old and already learning to do the work of women without understanding yet why that work was necessary, why her mother worked so hard, why sometimes her mother's hands would shake, even when she wasn't cold. And she had a youngest, a boy called Aino after his father, though the little one would never meet his father, because that's what the frontier does sometimes. It takes the people you love right in the middle of a Tuesday. The boy was born 2 years after his father died, though Aino never spoke about how that was possible, and the frontier community never asked because they already knew. Aino the younger was 5 years old when our story really begins, small for his age, pale in the way that children get pale when they spend most of their time indoors, when the cold keeps them confined, when food is short and nutrition is shorter. He had his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness, a dangerous combination that would serve him well later, but made him difficult to comfort when he was cold and scared. When Aino's husband died, it was pneumonia, came on fast like all the killer winters do. He was gone in less than a week. Fever on a Monday. Worse on Tuesday. Critical by Wednesday. Dead by Friday. That's the speed of winter death on the frontier. There's no time for last words or preparations, or coming to terms with anything. There's just the before and the after, and you're standing in the after wondering how you got there. She was 38 years old with 3 children and a cabin that couldn't hold heat worth a damn. Her hands were still bloody from washing his body when the community started coming. They came with casseroles that she had to cook because they came cold, brought by neighbors who thought their gesture was enough. They came with pity in their eyes and judgment in their posture. They came with suggestions about what she ought to do, and most of those suggestions involved remarrying quickly or going back east, where she'd have family. Mrs. Harjamaki actually said to her, this was at the funeral, mind you, "You'll need a man to run that homestead. It's not work for a woman alone." As if Aino had chosen widowhood, as if she'd decided to make things harder for herself just for the adventure of it. Nobody said it directly, but the message was clear. A woman alone on the frontier is a problem to be solved, not a person with solutions of her own. A problem requires solutions, and the solutions usually came in the form of another man, preferably one without resources of his own, so he'd be eager for what the widow could bring. The frontier didn't know what to do with women who wanted to survive on their terms. It only knew how to push them toward dependence. Aino had her mother-in-law, Kertu, living with her. Kertu was old, maybe 70, maybe older. Frontiersmen didn't count birthdays the way city folk did. She counted time in winters survived, in summers endured, in harvests brought in. Kertu had come from Finland when she was a girl herself, before she married, crossing an ocean in conditions that would make modern people weep. She came with nothing but the knowledge her mother had given her, the knowledge that had kept her people alive through centuries of winters that made Minnesota look like a vacation. Kertu carried with her all the old knowledge that her mother and her mother's mother had passed down like heirlooms, the kind of heirlooms nobody wanted anymore, the kind that took up space and were mostly just reminders of a past that modern America had moved on from. She knew which plants would heal you and which would kill you. She knew how to store food so it would last through months of cold. She knew the old ways of heating, the old ways of building, the knowledge that had been tested in Scandinavian winters that had no mercy. Most of that knowledge the frontier community had already decided was worthless. It was superstition. It was the old country, and they were modern now, American now, and modern meant that you bought things from catalogs and trusted what science magazines told you to trust. Modern meant you didn't rely on your grandmother's whispered wisdom. You relied on progress, on industry, on things that came packaged and labeled and cost money you didn't have. That first winter after Aino's husband died was brutal. The kind of brutal where December feels like it never leaves, where January feels like punishment for something you didn't do, where February stretches out and you stop believing spring is coming because maybe it isn't. Maybe winter is permanent now. Maybe this is the new world and you have to accept it. The cabin's fireplace worked, but only if you kept feeding it wood constantly, and wood costs money that Aino didn't have. Wood was currency on the frontier. It was survival. A cord of wood cost between $4 and $6, depending on who you bought it from and how desperate they thought you were. And by mid-January, Aino was already calculating which days she could let the fire burn lower, which days she could leave the cabin at the mercy of the cold. It was a mathematics of survival. She worked, of course. Frontier women always work. She took in mending from the wealthier families in the settlement. Mrs. Harjamaki had her doing alterations on dresses that cost more than Aino made in a month. She did laundry, standing outside in cold that made your fingers purple, beating clothes against rocks to get the dirt out, then soaking her hands in lye that burned and cracked her skin until her fingers looked like they belonged to something other than a human woman. She cleaned houses for families who kept their cabins warm and didn't understand why she was always shaking. She did anything that would put food on the table, and maybe, if she was lucky, if she rationed carefully, let her buy enough wood to not freeze to death. But here's what nobody talks about when they talk about frontier survival. It's not dramatic. It's not the kind of thing that makes for stories that get passed down. It's just the slow, grinding cold. It's the way your fingers stop working right, really stop working, where you can't hold a needle anymore because the cold has made them too stiff, too painful. It's the way the children cry because they're cold all the time, and you can't fix it because there's nothing left to give them. It's Aino, the little one, waking up at 3 a.m, shaking so hard his teeth chatter and his whole body convulses. And you know you've already burned every piece of wood you can afford for the day. The fire's already dying down to coals, and you don't have anything left to give him, except your own body heat and a mother's desperation. You pull him under your blanket. You hold him against your chest. You try to warm him with your own body, which is also cold, also failing, also running out of heat. You listen to him cry because he's uncomfortable and you can't fix it. You wonder, in those 3 a.m. moments, if everyone else's children are cold too, or if it's just your failure, just your inability to provide, just what happens when you're a woman alone trying to do the work of 2 people. That's the real frontier. That's what it looks like when you're losing. That's what it looks like every single morning when you wake up and realize you have to do it all again. Juko was 16. He was old enough to understand what was happening. He was old enough to see that his mother was failing, not in her will, which remained stubborn and unwavering, but in her body. She was getting thinner. Her cheekbones were becoming sharp. Her clothes were hanging off her shoulders. Her hands were developing sores from the lye in the water she used for washing, deep, painful cracks that would sometimes bleed when she bent her fingers too far. The cough that had started in December wasn't getting better. It was getting worse. It was a sound that carried dread with it, the kind of cough that reminded everyone on the frontier of the people who had that same cough last winter and didn't make it to spring. Kaisa was trying to be brave, but she was only 12, and a 12-year-old can't really maintain courage. She can only pretend, and the pretending gets exhausting. She'd put on a brave face during the day, help her mother with work, take care of little Aino, keep things moving. But at night, when she thought everyone was sleeping, you could hear her crying quietly, trying to muffle it so she wouldn't worry anyone. She understood at 12 what took me 40 years to understand. Sometimes the brave thing isn't pretending you're not scared. Sometimes the brave thing is just not telling anyone else how scared you are, so they don't have to carry that weight too. One evening in January, when the temperature had dropped to a level that made the cabin feel less like a home and more like a slowly collapsing cage, when breathing felt like swallowing ice and the walls seemed to be closing in with the weight of the cold, Kertu sat by the fire and started talking. She was mending something. Always mending, these frontier women. They could make a shirt last 10 years if they had to, could patch a hole so carefully that you almost couldn't see where the damage had been. The needle moved steadily through the worn fabric, her old hands working with a precision that came from 70 years of repetition. Her voice was quiet, but certain, the kind of voice that carried the weight of memory and knowledge. She said something that made Joko look up from his work, made Aino stop for a moment in what she was doing, made even little Aino go still. "When I was a girl," Kertu said, not looking up from her mending, "in Finland, my mother's mother taught us something about heat. Not the heat of fire, that's obvious, anyone with intelligence can burn wood, but heat that comes from another source, heat that comes from the earth itself, from things that break down, from the work of bacteria that you can't see but can feel. My mother told me, the earth remembers everything. It remembers warmth. It remembers every summer it has ever held. You just have to know how to ask it. I never understood it then. Not really. I was too busy becoming American, too busy thinking the old ways were beneath me, too busy ashamed of my accent and my mother's ways. But I remember now. I remember because my hands are cold, and so are yours, I know, and I watch your children shaking at night, and I remember what it felt like to be warm. Aino looked at her mother-in-law. She was desperate enough to listen. That's what people don't understand about the frontier. Desperation creates a kind of clarity that nothing else can. When you're cold enough, bone cold, the kind of cold that gets into your joints and makes you wonder if you'll ever feel warm again. When you're hungry enough that you're eating the same thin soup 3 nights in a row. When you're scared enough for your children that you're measuring out which ones need extra food because they're sicker, weaker, more at risk. When you're all of those things at once, you listen to things you might have dismissed before. You listen to your mother-in-law telling you about old knowledge. You listen like your life depends on it, because it does. Tell me, Aino said. It wasn't a question, really. It was a demand. It was the voice of a mother who has run out of options and is grasping for anything that might work. My mother packed our cabin walls, Kertu continued, not pausing in her mending, the needle continuing its rhythm through the fabric, with horse manure. Old manure, composted, the kind that had been sitting for years. She mixed it with straw. The straw is important. It gives the material structure, gives the bacteria space to work, and packed it into the gaps between the logs, pressed it in tight, sealed it in with clay mixed with water. My father thought she was mad. Absolutely mad. He wanted her to stop, said it was foolish, said it would ruin the cabin. The whole village thought she was mad. The priest came and told her it was unnatural. But here's the thing about being called mad. Sometimes the mad people are the ones who survive. Kertu looked up for the first time, met Ino's eyes directly. That winter, the winter the river froze so solid that people were afraid it would never thaw, that people actually worried the ice would hold for years and years, and we'd all starve. That winter our cabin was warm, not just warm enough, actually warm. The manure broke down from the inside. It starts to decompose, and the process creates heat, actual, measurable heat. Bacteria. I didn't have a word for it then, not really, but I knew it created warmth. I felt it radiating from the walls. My mother called it the Earth's memory of warmth, but what it really was science. It was the old knowledge that used to be science, before science became something that only came from books. Now, when Kertu said this, Juko expected his mother to dismiss it. He was old enough to understand how the world worked, old enough to know that people didn't do things like pack their walls with manure. It was foolish. It was superstition. It was exactly the kind of thing that the community mocked old people for believing. He expected his mother to thank his grandmother for the story, but move on, to nod politely, and then continue with the work of surviving the way everyone else did. That's what sensible people do. That's what people who want to fit into the frontier community do. They listen to the old ways with politeness, and then they ignore them completely. But Aino was not that kind of sensible. Aino was the kind of sensible that only came from desperation and mathematics. How much wood did your cabin use? Aino asked her mother-in-law. She set down whatever she was working on, mending, it was always mending, and gave her full attention. For the heating, with the walls packed. How much wood would you need to burn? A quarter, Kertu said. A quarter of what you're burning now, maybe less if you packed the walls thick enough and sealed them right. My father kept the main fire going just to cook, just to warm the space closest to it. The walls did the rest of the work. The heat radiated steadily from them, all through the day and night. The cabin stayed warm. warm enough to grow things on a windowsill. We had herbs growing in the dead of winter, warm enough that the children had color in their cheeks instead of looking like little ghosts, like your Ano looks now. I watched him earlier and he looked like a little ghost, a cold little ghost. Juko watched his mother's face change. It was like watching someone come alive, like watching a light come on behind her eyes. It was like watching a door open onto a room they didn't know was there. His mother's hands were white at the knuckles, clenched in her lap. She was calculating. He could almost see the calculations happening behind her eyes, not just the numbers of wood and money and survival, but the deeper calculations, the mathematics of hope. What it would cost, what it would take, what it would mean if it worked. And most importantly, what it would mean if it didn't work and they'd just wasted the last of their resources on something foolish. Where would I get manure? Aino asked. Horses. There must be horses somewhere. The Harjamakis have horses, don't they? Harjamaki has 6 of them, Kertu said, naming one of the neighboring farmers. Big work horses. There's manure piled behind his stable all winter, stacks of it. He never uses it, never has, just lets it sit there and freeze in the cold. But it's just sitting there, going to waste. That's what bothers me about these modern farmers. They don't understand that nothing is truly waste if you know what to do with it. 100 years ago, a pile of manure like that would have been treasure. Now it's just refuse. And the smell? Aino asked. She was thinking practically, already considering obstacles, already running through the community reactions in her head. Surely there's a smell. The whole settlement would know. They'd know what I was doing. There is, Kirta admitted. Oh yes, there's a smell. It's strong. It's unmistakable. It's the kind of smell that carries on the wind. But it goes away. Once you seal it with the clay and the straw, once everything settles and the decomposition really starts, it transforms. The smell changes from raw manure to something earthier. The smell fades. What's left is just earth. Just the smell of good soil breaking down. Most people won't even notice it after a few weeks. Most people, Aino repeated. But some people will. Some people will be very interested in what you're doing, Kertu said. Especially men. Especially men like Pesonen, who can't be happy unless he has something to mock. How much manure? Aino asked. How much would I need? Really? How much? For a cabin this size, Kertu said, looking around at the small space they all shared. Perhaps 20, 30 loads. Maybe more. Enough to pack it thick between every gap, every crevice, every place the wind comes through. You want it deep, 4, 5 inches thick, maybe more. 6 inches if you can manage it. The bacteria need volume to work. That's where the heat comes from. The decomposition needs room to happen, needs air pockets, needs material to work with. That's where the straw comes in. The straw creates the structure. The manure is the fuel. Aino nodded slowly. She was quiet for a long moment, calculating. She looked around the cabin, measuring the walls with her eyes, counting the gaps, running numbers in her head. Juko could see her doing it. Then she said, Tomorrow I'll go to Harjamaki and ask him. I'll explain it was for insulation. I'll make it sound practical and sensible. He might say no, Kertu said. He might think you're foolish, too. Then I'll ask someone else, Aino said. She spoke with a flatness that was actually more terrifying than anger would have been. I'll ask everyone I have to. I have 3 children, Kertu. I have 3 children and a cabin that's failing them. I have a son who's growing into a man while watching his mother fail. I have a daughter who's learning that the world's answer to women's problems is to marry another man. I have a youngest who shivers all night long. I can't afford pride anymore. I can't afford to care what people think. I can only afford solutions. And if the only solution is to pack my cabin with manure and let the community laugh, then they're going to laugh. That's how it started, not with a grand gesture, not with some romantic act of defiance, but with Aino walking over to Harjamaki's farm the next morning, with Juko at her side, both of them coming to ask if she could have the horse manure. The temperature was well below freezing. The wind came off the prairie like something alive and angry. Juko's face was pale, his cheeks pink with cold, his breath coming in small clouds. Aino's hands were bare because she'd forgotten her gloves, or more likely, she'd given them to one of the children. She was polite when she asked. That was important. Frontier women knew how to ask for things politely, knew how to make themselves small enough to fit into a man's generosity. She explained it was for insulation, for packing between the logs, for creating an air barrier that would trap heat. She didn't mention her mother-in-law's stories or the old Finnish knowledge because she already knew what people would say. She knew the jokes that would come. She was getting ahead of them in her head, already bracing for the mockery. Harjamaki was puzzled. He was a big man, the kind who moved slowly but meant everything he said. He listened to her explanation, scratched his beard with one hand, and looked at the pile of manure behind his stable with an expression that suggested he'd never given it much thought before. It was just a fixture of his farm, the way a pile of rocks might be. It was there. It was constant. It was part of the landscape. Insulation? He repeated. From manure? He said it like he was trying to fit the words together in his head, and they refused to make sense. From the heat that comes when it decomposes, Aino said. She was calm. She was clear. She wasn't defensive, which was a skill she'd learned from being a woman on the frontier. If you got defensive, men thought you were hysterical. If you stayed calm, they sometimes listened. My mother-in-law's family used this method in Finland for generations. The bacteria in the manure break down the organic material and create heat as a byproduct. The heat radiates through the walls. It keeps the cabin warm through the winter without requiring as much wood. She said it like it was facts, like it was science. Which, of course, it was. Harjamaki looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Juko, at the boy's thin face, at his obvious cold. Then back at Aino. He said, I suppose that's something. I don't understand it particularly, but I suppose if it works, that's what matters. Take what you want. It's just sitting here getting frozen. Better it goes somewhere useful than just sitting here going to waste. He said that to her directly, genuinely meaning it. But she could see him thinking. She could see him already starting to wonder what on earth this widow was up to. What kind of strange idea she'd gotten into her head. He was the kind of man who would probably mention it to someone, who might question things later, after she'd left his property. You're a peculiar woman, I know, he added, not unkindly. There was something in his voice that suggested he didn't mean it as an insult. But I respect the resourcefulness. Most people just accept what they're given. You're trying to solve things. That takes a particular kind of mind. Peculiar or alive, Aino said. She said it quietly, but with absolute certainty. I choose alive. And I choose my children alive. So yes, I'm peculiar. The wondering didn't stay quiet for long. By the next afternoon, half the settlement knew that Aino was collecting horse manure. By the evening, she was the subject of careful, knowing looks and whispered conversations in kitchens and store corners. By the following day, she was a source of great hilarity. The kind of hilarity that comes when someone does something outside the acceptable range of behavior, and the community needs to laugh to feel safe again. Pesonen. And there's always a pesonen, isn't there? Every community's got one. A man whose main occupation seems to be thinking poorly of other people, finding fault in everything everyone does. Pesonen made a joke about it at the general store. He said something like, That Finnish widow's lost her mind completely. She's building a cabin out of shit. Literal shit. What's next? Is she going to use her own piss for the roof? And the men laughed. It was the kind of laugh that carries. It travels through a small settlement like a virus. It spreads from person to person, gets worse as it goes, becomes exaggerated with each retelling. The laughter spread to the women too, though theirs was different, quieter, more complicated. It had layers to it that the men's laughter didn't. There was judgment in it, yes, but also something else. Something like pity, maybe, or recognition. Mrs. Lato actually came by the post office and asked Clara if she'd heard what Ano was doing. Clara, according to the records I found, said something like, "I think she's trying to keep her children alive. I think some of these men would benefit from trying the same thing instead of laughing about it. I think most of them would rather laugh than think." Clara was a remarkable woman. Not many frontier women would have said that out loud, but even Clara's support didn't change the fact that the community had decided this was foolish. This was desperate. This was what happened when you didn't remarry quickly enough, when you started thinking you could solve problems on your own instead of accepting help from a man. This was what happened when a woman got ideas above her station. Here's what happens when a community decides you're doing something ridiculous. They don't help you. They watch. They wait. They gather in small groups and shake their heads and make predictions about your failure with the kind of confidence that only comes from people who've never had to make hard choices, never had to choose between pride and survival. Leto, another neighbor, actually came by and warned Eno against it. He came in the early morning, caught her as she was about to start carrying buckets of manure to the cabin. She'd already filled 3 buckets from the pile at Harjamaki's. She was getting ready to start the work of packing. "I know," he said, and his tone was almost kind, which somehow made it worse. Kindness from someone who thinks you're foolish is a particularly cruel form of patronization. The smell alone will kill you. I've known people, good people, who couldn't breathe near manure piles. It'll poison the air for miles. It'll poison the water. Your neighbors won't stand for it. They'll make your life here impossible. The smell will go away once it's sealed," Ino said. She didn't stop working. She continued preparing her buckets, mixing clay into a paste with water, her hands steady though the cold made them ache. It'll be sealed with clay and straw. Once it starts decomposing, the smell changes. It becomes something earthier. It becomes something else entirely. My mother-in-law's been through this in Finland. I trust her knowledge more than I trust your predictions. Your mother-in-law came here 50 years ago, Leto said. He said it like that proved something. Like time was the measure of knowledge. Things are different now. We're civilized now. We don't do things the old way. We're modern. We do things that make sense. We're also freezing to death, Ino said. She set down the bucket. She turned to look at him directly, and there was something in her face that made him step back slightly. My youngest woke up at 3 in the morning last week shaking so hard he couldn't speak. His whole body was convulsing. I had no more wood to burn. I was out of money. I was out of food to sell for money. I was out of options. So forgive me if I don't particularly care about being civilized right now. Civilized is a luxury, Mr. Leto. Alive is a necessity. And as for my neighbors, she continued, her voice steady but cold as the air around them, they're welcome to come see what I'm doing. They're welcome to stand here and watch. But I notice none of you have offered another solution. None of you have offered to help me buy more wood. None of you have suggested anything except that I should remarry or leave. None of you have done anything except laugh, so I'll do what I can with what I have, using knowledge that kept my family alive for generations. And if the smell bothers you, if the knowledge bothers you, if my refusal to accept your pity bothers you, then you're welcome to stay on your side of your property. Leto left, shaking his head, muttering about how women these days didn't know their place. Aino watched him go with an expression that suggested she found him pitiful. Then she went back to work. There was manure to carry. There were walls to pack. There were children to keep alive. The opinions of neighbors were a luxury she couldn't afford. Nobody came to see in a spirit of curiosity or support. Nobody came to help. Instead, they stood at distances and observed. Some from their property lines, some from their windows, all of them watching to see if this foolish widow would bring disaster down on the entire settlement. Aino worked through late January and into early February, moving methodically around the cabin, working with a pace that suggested she'd calculated exactly how much work needed doing and had decided to do it at a pace her body could sustain. Her children helped when they could. Juko carried buckets despite the cold, his young back straining under the weight of materials that had to be transported from Harjamaki's farm. The buckets were heavy. Wet manure weighs more than you'd think. He'd make the trip repeatedly, and you could see him getting stronger just from the work, growing into his body, becoming more of a man with each load. Kaisa mixed the clay with water and soil the way Kertu had taught her, her small hands working steadily, her face set with concentration. Clay is more difficult to work than you'd expect. It resists. It gets cold and sticky. It requires force. Kaisa's hands would be raw at the end of each day, marked with clay that had dried and cracked the skin. Her lips would be chapped from the wind. But she kept working. Even little Aino brought small bundles of straw, his little fingers freezing after just a few minutes outside, but his face set with the determination of a child trying to save his family. He understood, in the way children understand things without being told directly, that his mother was fighting for him, that this work, difficult and cold and demanding as it was the difference between survival and failure. He was 5 years old and already understanding sacrifice. That's what the frontier did to children. The work was grueling. Aino's hands blistered within the first week. Not small blisters, big, water-filled blisters that would burst when she grabbed a bucket too hard, that would leave her hands bleeding. By the second week, the blisters had turned to calluses thick and hardened. Her back ached. Her arms ached. The muscles in her shoulders screamed. She worked from dawn until the light failed. And in January, on the frontier, that's not very long, maybe 5 or 6 hours of actual work time. And sometimes she continued by lamplight when the temperature was right, when the wind wasn't so fierce that working outside felt like an act of violence against herself, like the cold itself was trying to kill her. She worked while her neighbors watched from their property lines. She worked while Pesonen and his wife made jokes loud enough for her to hear on purpose. "Look at the manure woman," Pesonen said one afternoon, loud enough that she'd hear. "Packing her cabin with it. What comes next? Does she eat it?" His wife laughed with him. It was a particular kind of cruelty. The kind where you say things specifically to be heard, where you want the person to know they're being mocked, where the mockery is part of the point. She worked while Harjamaki's wife watched from her window with an expression that might have been concern or might have been judgment. Aino couldn't tell which, and found she didn't particularly care. What people thought of her was becoming increasingly irrelevant. What mattered was warmth. What mattered was her children's survival. Everything else was secondary. The packing process itself was complicated in a way Aino hadn't fully anticipated. It wasn't just a matter of throwing manure into the cracks between logs. You had to compress it. You had to press it in hard, using your hands, and sometimes a flat tool to make sure it was packed firmly enough that it wouldn't shift as the weather changed, as the temperatures fluctuated, as the material began to break down and compact further. You had to think about the geometry of the spaces. Some cracks were wide, some were narrow and deep. You had to layer it carefully, manure down first, then straw to create air pockets for decomposition, then clay to seal it all, then manure again, then straw again, then clay. A rhythm, a pattern, almost a dance, except it smelled terrible and your hands were covered in things that would make you ashamed to touch your children. Aino would have to wash her hands constantly, scrubbing them raw with soap and cold water before touching her children, before preparing food, before anything. "Is it worth it?" Kaisa asked one afternoon, her voice small and tired. She was 12 years old and she was tired in a way that only comes from real work. She was tired the way adults get tired. "Mama, is this going to work? Are we going to be warm?" "Yes," Aino said. She didn't qualify it. She didn't hedge her bets. She didn't say maybe or probably or if this works or I hope so. "Yes, it's worth it. It will work. Keep mixing. We need more clay. The walls need to be sealed properly." "How do you know?" Kaisa asked. "Because your great-grandmother knew," Aino said. "Because Kertu's family survived winters in Finland, that would kill us all. Because the knowledge came all the way across the ocean to us. And that knowledge is real. I know it's worth it because I have to believe it's worth it. Now keep mixing." Juko worked differently than his sister. He didn't ask if it was worth it. He didn't question. He worked as if the answer was already understood, as if the only questions that mattered were whether they would do enough, whether they would finish, whether they would succeed. He was 16 years old and he was thinking like a man about the survival of his family. He'd lost his father. He understood now that men don't always survive. That meant the work fell to him. That meant his mother couldn't do this alone. That meant he had to be strong enough to help her be strong. One afternoon, carrying a particularly heavy bucket, he stumbled. He nearly fell. He caught himself against the cabin wall, the cold of the wood shocking through his clothes. "I'm all right," he said, before Aino could ask. "I'm fine. I can keep working." "I know you can," Aino said. She didn't treat him like a child. She didn't coddle him. She treated him like what he was, a young man doing a man's work. "But I need you to work smart, not just hard. Pace yourself. We have weeks of this. Hurrying now just means collapsing later." Aino worked until her hands blistered, and then she wrapped them in cloth strips and kept working. She worked until her muscles screamed their protest, until her arms burned, until she could barely lift the buckets. But she didn't stop. She worked until the cabin looked different, darker, yes, but also somehow more solid, more protected. The dark brown manure mixed with straw showed in the cracks between the logs, like a different kind of mortar. The cabin took on a new appearance. It looked like something was being done to it. It looked like someone was fighting back against the cold. This was the failure moment nobody could see coming. The moment when Aino's cabin had walls packed with decomposing horse manure, while the community waited for disaster. While Pessanen and Leto and the others whispered about how foolish she was, how desperate, how the smell would poison them all, how she was making a fool of herself and dragging her children down with her. The community was convinced this was going to end in suffering. They were waiting for proof that they'd been right to mock her. But here's what Kertu had understood, what the old knowledge had taught her. Bacteria don't care what people think. They don't care if you're respectable or foolish, approved of or mocked. They don't care if you're Finnish or American or anything in between. They don't care about frontier community opinions or social niceties. They just do what bacteria do, which is break down organic matter and create heat as a byproduct. It's inevitable. It's chemical. It's thermodynamic. It's science, though in 1887 on the frontier, if it wasn't something you could buy from a catalog or read about in a modern magazine, if it wasn't something that came from the East Coast or Europe with proper credentials attached, it might as well have been magic or superstition. People were afraid of what they didn't understand, and they masked that fear with mockery. The smell lasted about 3 weeks. It was terrible, thick and overwhelming and organic in a way that made people gag. It smelled like decay. It smelled like death. It smelled like every outhouse and refuse pile combined. It was the kind of smell that got into your clothes, your hair, your skin. It was the kind of smell that made you question every decision that had led you to this moment. Pesonen complained about it loudly. He complained to anyone who would listen. "The smell is toxic," he said. "It's killing us all slowly. That widow is poisoning the entire settlement." He said this standing downwind of Aino's cabin, which meant the wind was actually carrying the smell away from him. But he didn't care about accuracy. He cared about being right, about having proof that Aino was foolish. Leto actually threatened to report Aino to the territorial authority, though there was no rule against using manure for insulation, because nobody had been foolish enough to try it before. The territorial authority would probably have thought it was a waste of their time anyway. "There are laws against this kind of thing," Leto said. "Public nuisance, health hazard, something." But here's what nobody could deny. 3 weeks passed, and then slowly the smell began to change. It shifted from the acrid, choking smell of raw manure to something earthier, something that smelled more like soil and straw, and the breaking down of organic things. The raw sewage smell faded. The gagging quality of it disappeared. The smell became something that you could stand near without feeling ill. By the first week of February, the smell was almost entirely gone. What remained was just the faint smell of earth and decomposition, the kind of smell you get from turning over a garden bed in spring. Unpleasant if you thought about it too much, if you dwelt on what was decomposing, what transformation was happening, but not poisoning anyone, not making anyone sick, not doing anything except slowly, methodically, steadily creating heat. The packing was done by mid-February. Aino had managed to pack the walls thoroughly, 4 to 5 inches of manure mixed with straw, sealed with clay, all around the perimeter of the cabin. Her hands were scarred from the work. From her back bore the strain. But it was done. And now came the waiting period, the time when you had to trust that the science would work, that the bacteria would do their job, that the heat would come. By early March, when the worst of winter had already hit, and it hit hard, a cold snap in late February that came with wind that screamed like something alive and angry, that drove temperatures down to levels that made the previous cold feel mild, that made you wonder if winter would ever end. The truth became undeniable. Aino discovered it first. It was an accident, really. She was standing near one of the walls, about to do something. I think she was reaching for something on a shelf. And her hand brushed against the outer wall. It was warm. Not just slightly warm. Warm. Heat radiating out from the log surface. She stopped moving. She put her whole hand flat against the wall and just held it there. "Kertu," she called. "Kertu, come here." Kertu came over. Aino showed her the wall. Kertu put her hand against it and closed her eyes for a moment. "It's working," she said. Just that. "It's working." Aino's cabin stayed warm, not just warm enough to be tolerable, genuinely warm. The kind of warm that made you understand what comfort meant. The kind of warm that made you realize how cold you'd been. She was using half, less than half, the wood she had been using the year before. The fireplace still burned. She still needed wood for cooking and for that central heat. But the walls were carrying the burden now. The walls were doing the work that before had required constant feeding of the fire, constant attention, constant exhaustion. The children stopped shaking at night. This happened gradually, but it happened. By mid-March, little Aino stopped waking up in the middle of the night, crying from cold. His little face started to gain color, real color, not just the pink of windburn. Kaisa had energy again. She could actually think. She could actually do things without it requiring all of her will. Chuko's expression shifted from grim determination, the expression of a child trying to hold together a family. to something that looked almost like hope. It was a subtle shift, but it was there. A lightening. A possibility that maybe they would make it. Maybe they would survive. Maybe the winter wouldn't kill them. They could all feel it in the cabin, the steady, constant warmth that came from the walls, that radiated out and filled the space, that made it livable, survivable, almost comfortable. Aino would stand in the middle of the cabin at night and just feel the warmth coming from all directions. It was like being surrounded by living things. It was like being held. After months of fighting the cold, of losing the battle every single night, of going to bed wondering if morning would come, the warmth was extraordinary. That's when the community had to do something harder than mocking a desperate woman. They had to admit she was right, and that was so difficult for them that some of them never fully managed it. Harjamaki came by in early March, when the weather had temporarily broken enough for traveling, a brief thaw, a few days of almost tolerable cold. He showed up at Aino's door in the afternoon. He stood outside for a moment, clearly gathering his courage. Then he knocked. When Aino opened the door, the warmth poured out. Actual, measurable warmth. Harjamaki stood in that warmth with an expression on his face like he'd been hit. "It's warm in here," he said. Not a question. A statement of fact that he couldn't quite believe even though he was experiencing it. He said it like he hadn't believed it when he heard the rumors filtering through the settlement, but now he was standing in the doorway and feeling it for himself, and there was no denying it. "Yes," Aino said. She didn't make it easy for him. She didn't say, "Well, of course you were curious." She didn't perform warmth or welcome or any of the softening behaviors that a frontier woman was supposed to perform when receiving a man. She just confirmed the fact in a way that made it clear she found him slow. She was tired. She was done performing. She was done being grateful for a man's acknowledgement of her own success. "The manure," he said. He still looked confused. "That's what's doing it? Just manure?" "The bacteria in the manure," Aino said. She didn't invite him inside. She stood in the doorway, the warmth of the cabin behind her. "My mother-in-law's mother knew this technique in Finland, and her mother before her knew it. The bacteria break down the organic material and create heat as a byproduct. It's a biological process. You just have to seal it properly with clay and give it time. It's not magic, it's not superstition. It's just science that doesn't come from a catalog or a science magazine." Harjamaki stepped inside slightly. He looked around the cabin. He looked at Juko, who was old enough to meet his gaze steadily and did so without flinching or deferring. He looked at Kaisa and little Aino, both of them healthy and warm, and visibly better than they had been when he'd last seen them. Their cheeks had color, real color, not the grayish pallor of cold and undernourishment. Their eyes had brightness. Their whole bodies carried a vitality that had been absent before. He could see the difference in them. He could see it clearly. This wasn't a subtle change. This was transformation. "How much manure did you use?" he asked. "How many loads?" "Enough to pack the walls thoroughly," Aino said. 4 to 5 inches thick. "Not as much as you'd think, though. The straw takes up most of the space. The manure is just the activating agent. It's the carrier of the bacteria. The bacteria are what matter. The manure is just the vehicle they travel in." Harjamaki nodded slowly. He was still processing. "And you're saying this works?" he asked. "This method? It actually works?" "I'm not saying anything," Aino said. She met his eyes directly. "I'm standing in a warm cabin that hasn't cost me a fortune in firewood to heat. I'm standing in a cabin where my children have stopped being cold all the time. I'm standing in a space where the air is warm enough that you can breathe and not feel like you're being attacked. That's not saying something. That's reality. The reality is working whether you understand it or not." By the next week, Harjamaki was packing manure into his own cabin walls, despite the jokes that came his way. His wife was the one who pushed for it, actually. "If it works, I want my house warm," she apparently said. So there was Harjamaki, doing the same work Aino had done, carrying the same buckets, packing the same mixture. The work was as grueling for him as it had been for her, but he had the benefit of knowing it would work. Knowledge changes everything. By the week after that, Leto had come to ask Aino directly how to do it. He came to her door at night, after dark, like it was something shameful. Like he was ashamed to be asking for help from a woman he'd spent months mocking. He admitted quietly that his daughter had been ill all winter. Really ill. The kind of ill that made him worry she wouldn't survive. They needed the cabin warmer. He needed this to work. Aino showed him anyway. She didn't make him grovel. She didn't say, "I told you so," though she had every right to. She didn't perform anger or hurt or resentment, even though she'd earned the right to all three. She just showed him how it was done. She explained the layering process. She told him what ratio of manure to straw worked best. She told him the importance of sealing with clay. She treated him like he had a legitimate question and deserved a legitimate answer. That's the kind of grace that takes more strength than anger ever could. Even Pesonen, though he never apologized. Men like Pesonen don't apologize. They just stop doing the thing they were doing. Even he was seen gathering manure from the settlement's communal pile one afternoon in late March. He didn't ask for advice. He just started working, packing his own cabin walls the same way Aino had. The mockery stopped. Not because he acknowledged it had been wrong, but because he couldn't deny the evidence anymore. His own cabin got warmer. His own children got healthier. The proof was undeniable. By spring, word was spreading through the entire region about this method of insulation that worked better than anything anybody had tried before. It was revolutionary. It was practical. It was within reach of anyone with access to horses or other livestock. Farmers were sending representatives to ask Aino about it directly. People were writing letters from other settlements, distant communities that had heard rumors about a Finnish widow who'd figured out how to heat a cabin with manure. The knowledge that had been dismissed as superstition, as old country foolishness, as a woman's desperate gamble, was suddenly valuable. It was suddenly science. The confrontation, when it really came, was quieter than you might expect. It came in April, after the snow had started to melt, when the community gathered for a spring meeting at the general store. The snow was dripping off the roof. The air had that peculiar smell that only spring has, earth emerging from ice, frost retreating, the possibility of survival replacing the certainty of hardship. The smell of manure from the entire settlement's melting piles, mixed with the smell of earth and new growth. Pesonen was there, of course. He'd been one of the most vocal mockers. He'd spent the winter making jokes. And now he finally said something about it directly, trying to close the topic. He said something like how maybe he'd been too quick to judge, how the widow's method had proven useful after all, how it was actually pretty clever when you thought about it. It wasn't an apology. It was worse in some ways. It was a dismissal of the dismissal, a way of moving on, as if he hadn't spent months mocking her, as if the laughter hadn't happened, as if the cruelty had been acceptable, and now they could all just move forward together like it hadn't occurred. Aino let him have it. Not angrily, not with raised voice. She wasn't that kind of angry. Her anger was something colder and more precise. She spoke with clear words that cut through the gathering like a knife. "You laughed," she said to him, and to the others who'd laughed with him. "You laughed when my children were cold. You laughed when I was working 16 hours a day trying to keep us alive. You laughed when I was using a method that people have known about for generations, a method that your own families probably came from countries where this same knowledge had survived for centuries. You laughed at something that your own ancestors probably knew how to do, that you'd forgotten because you were too busy calling yourselves civilized." She paused. She looked directly at Pessinen, and then she looked at Lehto, at the others who'd stood at the edges of the laughter, at the women who'd whispered, at the men who'd made jokes. "I don't accept your silence on this. I'm not going to let you just move on and not acknowledge that you were wrong. You were wrong. You were wrong to mock me. You were wrong to doubt. You were wrong to assume that knowledge has to be modern to be valid, that it has to come from a magazine or a store to matter. You were wrong to assume a woman with an idea was foolish just because you didn't understand it. And I need to hear you say it. Not because I need your validation. I stopped needing that the moment I realized my children's warmth mattered more than your approval. But because if you don't acknowledge that you were wrong, you'll do it to someone else. You'll mock the next woman with an idea you don't understand. You'll dismiss the next innovation because it doesn't fit your understanding of how the world works. And I won't have it. I won't stand by while you do to someone else what you did to me." That's what surprised them. That she demanded to be acknowledged as right, not just as tolerable. That she demanded accountability rather than acceptance. That she was refusing the easy way out, the social grace of forgetting about it and moving on. She was forcing them to actually face what they'd done. That was the moment when the community understood that Aino wasn't going to be grateful for approval anymore. She'd figured out how to survive without it. She'd figured out how to thrive in a way that didn't require their validation. She didn't need them to tell her she was right. She knew she was right. But she needed them to acknowledge that they had been wrong. Pessinen actually said it. He stood there in the general store with everyone listening, with the spring light coming through the windows, and he said, "You were right. I was wrong." It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't heartfelt. His face was red. He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. But it was something. It was an acknowledgement. It was a man admitting that a woman he'd mocked had known something he didn't. It was, in its own way, a defeat. And defeat, publicly acknowledged, is a kind of honor. The ripples from that winter spread through the entire frontier. The method became known throughout the region, called Finnish insulation. Though it wasn't really Finnish, it was ancient. It came from a time before countries, before borders, before people decided that knowledge had to come from certain places to be legitimate. It came from the deep past, from generations of people who lived in cold climates and figured out what worked and passed that knowledge down to their daughters like a precious gift. The knowledge had survived the journey across the Atlantic, hidden in the mind of an old woman named Kertu, waiting for someone desperate enough and brave enough to try it when everyone else said it was foolish. Aino stayed on the frontier. She never remarried, though she had opportunities. There were always men willing to take a useful widow, a woman who'd proven she could solve problems. But Aino didn't need rescuing anymore. She'd rescued herself. She ran her homestead with Juko's help as he grew into a man. She built on what she'd started. She became one of the most respected people in the settlement, not because the settlement had suddenly learned to value women's knowledge or had become enlightened about gender, but because she'd proven what she knew on her own terms, and nobody could deny it anymore. The proof was visible in every cabin that used her method. The proof was in the survival of children who would have died in previous winters. She taught other women the method. She taught them how to calculate the amount of manure needed for their cabin size. She taught them how to pack the walls, how to seal them properly with clay, how to manage the process during the smell phase, how to layer manure and straw and clay to create the maximum decomposition action. She taught them how to work with their children in the cold, how to make a difficult task into a family project. She became, in her way, what we might now call an engineer or an innovator, though the frontier didn't have a word for that when it came to women. They just called her the woman who knew things, the woman you went to when you needed help, the woman who'd figured something out and wasn't ashamed to tell you how she'd done it. Kaisa grew up to be someone who understood, deep in her bones, that the community's approval wasn't required for something to be true. She carried that understanding her whole life. The knowledge that she could trust her own mind, that she could trust the knowledge passed to her by her mother and her grandmother, that the community's laughter was often just the sound of their own fear. She became a teacher, and she taught children that knowledge comes from many places, that old doesn't mean invalid, that understanding takes work, but mockery is always easier. She taught them to think for themselves. Little Aino survived that winter and grew up strong. He remembered the warmth of those walls, the way his mother had fought for his survival with a substance that people had mocked, with knowledge that had been dismissed as superstition, with a stubbornness that had been called foolishness until it proved itself true. He remembered waking up in the middle of the night and not being cold anymore. He remembered the transformation. He became a farmer himself, and he never once forgot that lesson. He paced his homestead walls with manure before his son was even born. He taught his son what his mother had taught him, that knowledge is knowledge, regardless of where it comes from, that a woman's mind is as capable as a man's, that survival sometimes looks like listening to your grandmother. That's what I love about these stories. That's what gets me every time, gets me angry and proud all at once. It's not about the manure, really. It's not even about the insulation, though that was genuinely innovative and saved lives throughout the entire region, helped people survive winters that would have killed them otherwise. It's about the moment when a woman decides that she's not going to apologize for knowing something the people around her don't understand. It's about the moment when she stops asking for permission to be right. It's about the moment when she looks at her children shaking from cold and decides that their survival matters more than the community's comfort, more than the community's mockery, more than fitting in. The frontier was hard. It took people. It broke families. It made widows out of women who should have had entire lives ahead of them. But sometimes, if you were lucky and brave enough, if you were desperate enough to listen to your grandmother's whispered wisdom, it also gave you the space to become more than you were before. Not because the frontier was kind, it wasn't. God knows the frontier wasn't kind. Not because the community was enlightened, it wasn't. But because the frontier forced choices, and some women made choices that changed everything. Aino packed her cabin with manure that the community laughed at and mocked and predicted would fail. The bacteria in that manure did the work that wood could never do alone, that money could never buy, that the frontier's approved methods couldn't accomplish. She kept her children alive through a winter that killed other people's children. She proved something that her community needed to learn, even if they were slow about learning it. That knowledge doesn't become true because it's modern, and it doesn't become false because it's old. Knowledge is true because it works. Knowledge is true because it saves lives. Knowledge is true because a grandmother whispered it to her daughter on a winter night in a cold cabin, and that daughter whispered it to her son's wife, and that wife, when she was desperate enough and brave enough and stubborn enough, decided to listen, even when everyone was laughing. That's frontier legacy. That's the story of women who survived by understanding that what people think of you is far less important than what you know is real. What you know is real is what survives. What you know is real is what keeps your children alive. What you know is real is what matters when winter comes.